See how Tanium can power the ServiceNow Service Desk experience with real-time visibility and control on today's Tanium Tech Talk. Well, welcome back to Tanium Tech Talks. I'm your host, Ashley McGlone, and welcome to our series on integrations with ServiceNow. Hopefully by this time you've gotten a chance to see the one on ITAM or the asset management connection for your CMDB. So we've been hard at work building integrations for the service desk experience. You got to get those tickets closed. We're going to show you how Tanium makes that process better today with this integration. And so you can actually retrieve Tanium endpoint data directly in the ServiceNow console and then take action, remediate directly from that ServiceNow console. Now, if you watched the last show, you already met our guest, Brandon. He's back with us again today. Can you show us what this experience looks like?
Absolutely. So I'm going to walk through end to end, actually installing and configuring this experience in a ServiceNow environment. This search for Tanium here in the store is just going to show all the different integrations that we have published in the store, as well as the Service Graph connector for Tanium that is published by ServiceNow. What I want to focus on today is going to be two pieces. So one is we're going to get to the Tanium CI introspect UI, which is our live data. But first, wanted to go into this integration core. And this core SDK is quite literally the backbone of many of our integrations that we have published today. Within here, if you wanted to go ahead and install this SDK into your environment, again, all you have to do, search for Tanium in the ServiceNow Store, hit on Get. This is a free application that would be installed in your ServiceNow environment. There is a ton of supporting documentation. So I'm barely going to scratch the surface today on the capabilities of our core SDK. Yeah, so our CI introspect UI, we refer to it as introspect UI for short, is built on the core SDK. This is a UI that is custom built by Tanium, which allows us to create a direct connection to any Tanium managed endpoint directly from inside of ServiceNow. So any CI that is managed by Tanium, whether you are just looking at a computer record in the CMDB, or whether you are working on an incident, for example, there's a button to launch a live UI where you will get real-time data refreshed every few seconds about what is currently happening on this device. And then because of the capabilities of the core SDK, we can actually take action. And that action is completely configurable to your specific environment. You get real live data refreshed every few seconds through a direct connect to a Tanium managed CI from inside of ServiceNow. Well, with Introspect UI, you can actually see what is happening, if there are any health events that are occurring on here, if CPU is spiking, if the disk space is low. As you had noted, you can then take action to help remediate that. And then you can see live the results of those remediation actions, and everything that happens is logged against the CI record and the ticket, such as an incident in ServiceNow. So the next time somebody comes in and says, what did we do to actually fix this? It's all in the context of your ServiceNow environment.
We've been talking and our audience has been very patient. I'm ready to see this. Are you ready to show it to us?
I'm ready to show it. So I have not gone through the installation process on here. What I'm going to do, because this is a developer instance, I'm going to actually come in here to the system applications available to obtain from the store and click this link directly from in ServiceNow. Now, you have the ability, if you wanted to go to the ServiceNow store and you wanted to go to the integration core, the introspect UI, you could go to the store and you could log in there. I'm already logged into this instance, so I'm just going to access it from inside of ServiceNow. And I'm going to go ahead and search for Tanium. And first thing we're going to do is I'm going to request this Tanium CI introspect UI. If you are in a partner environment or in a customer environment, you'll be able to just get this app without requesting to actually install it. One other thing that I do want to note here, introspect UI does require the integration core SDK. So you can have the SDK installed and then install Introspect, or you can install it all together just by selecting Introspect UI from the store. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to request this. I'm going to install in the environment. Depending on your environment, it could take a minute or it could take 5 minutes. So once this install has completed, we're going to go ahead and jump over into how do we actually configure the core SDK for Introspect UI. So we can see here in my personal developer instance, I have the service graph for Tanium connected, and it is already pushing asset data from hardware and software in Tanium into ServiceNow. We also have options here for our Tanium CI Introspect UI. And then we have our integration core. And integration core is what we're going to be focusing on today. That's actually where we will do the configuration for the Introspect UI because it is built on integration core. So I'm going to jump in, and the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to hit the guided setup. So first thing in here is we're going to set the system properties. So I'm going to come on and I'm going to hit get started. And we can see the first thing in here is set the Tanium API endpoint property. And if I come in and hit configure on here, you may see this message if you are not switched over to integration core as the current application. This is very likely if you've just gone through the installation process. So you can either come up here and globally switch the application or just hit this button here and it's going to change the scope here. First thing this is going to ask us for is our Tanium API endpoint. And all this is our Tanium instance appended with /API /v2. One other thing to note in here, though, is this is our API endpoint. So what I'm going to need to do is right before the .cloud.tanium.com in this environment, because I'm connecting to a Tanium cloud, I'm going to do -API. So it will be your Tanium instance -API.cloud.tanium.com /API /v2. Next thing is we're going to do the same for our module API endpoint. So again, I'm going to put in our URL /plugins/products. And last, this is going to ask us here if we want to authenticate either with an API token or with a Tanium username. I'm going to jump over in a moment and we're going to generate an API token. But one thing that is going to be really important is sometimes when we generate an API token, we want to limit the scope of the API token for specifically what that integration calls for. So for integration core, because this SDK has the ability to do anything, your use cases and your permissions that you will want to assign to your persona in Tanium are going to be dependent on the specific modules, the specific actions, the specific computer groups that you want to enable. So if you have access in Tanium and you are looking for integration core capabilities around deploying software, gathering live performance data, getting additional asset data, you'll want to ensure that the user you use to generate that token in Tanium has access to all of the modules that you're going to want to extend the functionality through the Integration Core SDK. So even if you generate an API token that essentially has admin level access in Tanium, you can get extremely granular with your users in ServiceNow and what they are still able to do through the core SDK.
It's kind of like when you get on a video call and you're double muted. So you got to find the button to turn it on. So in this case, you've got a mute switch on both sides. You got permissions on both sides to make sure they're both green light before they'll be able to do anything. I like that.
Exactly. And that allows for possibilities like maybe certain users shouldn't even be able to see the Introspect UI button, or maybe you want that button to only appear if it's on a Tanium managed record. But this time when I generate the token, I'm going to generate it using a persona that has a little more access than last time when we generated for the Service Graph connector, and all I wanted was really the ability to read asset reports and to push that data through the API gateway. This time I want some more permissions. I want to see health events, and I want to be able to access different sensors, and I want to be able to deploy software. So I'm going to generate an API token that has more elevated permissions in Tanium than what was required for that Service Graph connector. So I'm going to come into Tanium, and I already have a persona set up that has the necessary permissions that I want. And again, this is going to be really dependent on each customer's environment. So I'm going to come in here and I'm just going to generate a new API token, and we'll call this one ServiceNow Core SDK. We'll leave the expiration as 7 days, and we'll be able to rotate this token automatically. And in my trusted IP addresses, I'm going to put the IP address or IP addresses that are specific to my ServiceNow environment where I want to allow incoming and outgoing connections. So once we have our IP address in here, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to create this token. And again, it's important whenever we copy a token that you do include the token hyphen at the beginning of this. So we'll want to copy this entire address. You can just hit copy API token button, and we'll come back into ServiceNow, and I'm going to paste my API token. If you wanted to authenticate using a username and password, that is always an option as well. Our preferred recommendation is always going to be to generate an API token using a persona that has the necessary permissions you want to allow for this token. And I am in a Tanium Cloud instance, so I do not need to worry about the mid server. If you are running Tanium Prem, then you are going to need to put in your mid server address. And by default, what we're looking for when we take action is the ability to target any of the computers in here. Specifically at this default all computers action group ID, it is asking for the ID for an action group in Tanium that by default is called default all computers. I'm going to jump back into Tanium. We're going to go to administration, actions, action groups. So administrations, actions, action groups. I'm going to find my default all computers, and then I'm just going to grab the ID up in the URL for this action group, come back into ServiceNow, and I'm going to paste this ID into this action group section. Coming down further, there's a bunch of configurations that are completely optional. Some important ones though, by default, we're going to mark this log Tanium actions as true. So anytime we are taking action, whether that is deploying software or referencing a sensor or performing a scripted action against an endpoint, we want to create a log or a record for that in ServiceNow. A couple other options on here, performance module enabled. So this is really critical to Introspect UI to allow us to make a direct connect to a device and is allowing us to get performance health events or system crashes from Tanium Performance. So if you have performance enabled in your Tanium environment, we're going to go ahead and we're going to check this as yes. There are also not going to go into every single one of these options, but you can see that there are a ton of configurations when it comes to how do you want your package names for quarantining on Windows machines, or for Linux machines, or for Mac machines. You can leave these by default. If you have any specific configurations that are changed from out-of-the-box Tanium, though, you'll want to come in and look at each of these options. One other note on here is track direct connect actions and action history. I choose to leave this unchecked by default. What this means is every time somebody uses Introspect UI and they direct connect to get live data around an endpoint, it's also going to keep a log of that. For my personal preference, I don't need to know every time somebody's doing live data, but I do want to know if they're taking action on that data. So I'm just going to leave this unchecked, and we'll hit save on here, and we'll mark as complete. We already have gone through several of these. So as part of that guided setup, instead of doing each of these steps individually, we set the API endpoint property, we set the token property. So I'm just going to come in here and start marking these as complete. Didn't need to set a username or password, so we'll hit skip on here. Didn't need to set the mid server because we're using a Tanium Cloud instance. We did mark this as performance, did get our action group ID. And then I'm going to come through and skip some of these other options that are in here. And again, these options, what you want to configure is going to be based on your specific Tanium environment and what you want to give people the ability to do in ServiceNow. So now I'm going to come back and we're going to go into our integration core setup. So the next thing that we have the ability to do through our Introspect UI is we can actually take action. So whether that is querying a sensor, doing a pre-scripted action from Tanium, or deploying software packages directly onto devices through that live connection. So I'm going to come in here to this sync Tanium packages and sensors. And this, again, is going to be specific to your environments, because what this is going to do is it is going to pull the actions that you have available in your Tanium environment, the deploy packages that are available within your deploy galleries, and the various package parameters that are set in your Tanium environment. So this will automatically pull everything, but the configuration of the actions that are available, the sensors that are available, or the deploy software that's available in your gallery is going to be specific to your own Tanium instance. So if
All
I
right,
come in
so
here,
I've got a question here. So if I'm going to sync these, and maybe you're going to answer this, and you can go ahead and click through there, but I'm curious, if I sync this, is this a one-time sync? Do I need to come in and click something periodically? How's that work?
oh, there it goes. So
Ah,
what it's going to do is, yep,
the repeat interval. Very good. All right. Yeah, I figured that was in there somewhere. Just want to make sure.
Yep. So the first one is going to sync our Tanium action packages. This is already pre-configured, so you don't need to change anything on here. We can see though by default what it's going to do is every single day we are going to look at the different actions that are available in Tanium, and we're going to sync those over to ServiceNow. So I will note, just by syncing over the actions or the sensors or the deploy gallery, that does not automatically make it available to everybody using Introspect UI. So we'll get into how do we take what has been synced and turn it into something usable. But all we're doing here is we're just scheduling these scripts to run on a daily basis to bring in the latest and greatest from Tanium when it comes to the sensors, actions, and your deploy gallery. So I'm going to go ahead and hit execute now. And then I'm going to come into our sensors and our deploy packages and do the same thing. It's already activated. I'm just going to hit execute now. And our deploy packages, going to come in, hit execute now. Deploy packages, one thing I will note, when we look at how often this refreshes, by default, it's going to be set to daily, and it's going to run using a time zone. So you have the availability to actually change this, but it does look just slightly different than the default periodical setup in the previous ones. Now that we've done this, I'm going to go through and I'm going to actually mark each of these as complete as well. So if we come back to our integration core setup, we have now gone through the authentication with Tanium. We have toggled to say our performance modules enabled. We've set our default action group ID from our Tanium instance. And then we have scheduled the jobs and executed them to come in, sync our action packages, sensors, and deploy packages. So the last thing that I want to do is I just want to run an automated test to make sure that everything's running as configured. So I'm going to come in here and I'm going to enable the ability for us to run this execution. All right, and now we're going to go ahead and just hit this Run Test Suite button up at the top here. Perfect. So again, as long as you have configured those Tanium URLs, and if you're using a Tanium cloud instance, be sure to append that -API before the .cloud.tanium.com. Each part of the guided setup, again, we've tried to make it as easy as possible, so it will instruct you exactly what needs to be put in there, the details with the URL. And if you've gotten to this step and the test suite has run successfully, that means that everything is configured properly as far as the connection between Tanium and ServiceNow via that API token.
Well, Brandon, this is great. I just love the experience here with the walkthroughs, the guided setup. It tells you where to go, what to click, and as long as you type things correctly, it should just work.
Most of the time involved through these configurations is just planning on how do you want to use this, what sort of access, what roles do we need to assign to people. As far as connecting Tanium to ServiceNow, we have tried to make it as easy as possible with as few steps as necessary.
So what's remaining then for us to actually see what it looks like in the ServiceNow console populated by Tanium data?
We're going to jump over and I'm going to actually do a couple things really quickly before we get into the introspect. So I'm going to come back here and at this point within our setup, we've actually gone through everything. And if I need to, I can go ahead and mark this as complete. So our integration core setup is now showing 100% complete. As I had mentioned a little while ago, we do include a number of different permissions or roles in ServiceNow for every user that's going to enable, do they have access to certain buttons? Are they able to query certain sensors? So what I'm going to do is I'm going to actually come into my user management, and I'm going to search for my user in here. So I'm going to come into my user, and I'm just going to come down to the roles, hit edit on here, and I'm going to type X_tan. And what we'll see is, as part of both Introspect UI and our integration core, we have a bunch of different roles that can now be assigned to your users. Not going to go into the details of every single one of these roles. They are thoroughly documented in that integration core SDK documentation that's available from within the ServiceNow store. But this is where you would control, should somebody, for example, be able to view system crashes? Should they be able to read different sensors? Should they be able to take action on the different sensors and execute different actions? So you can get extremely granular for every single individual user and then assign these roles based on individual users or based on groups of users in ServiceNow. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to grab everything and assign it to my user in this instance so that we can see it all come together. And now what I'm going to want to do is, if I come back into our all dropdown and I come into Tanium, before we get into this Introspect UI, as I had shown previously in the configuration, we synced over various sensors and actions and deploy packages. I can come in here to, for example, our Tanium sensors, and this is going to give a list of all the different sensors that have been brought over from our Tanium environment. Same thing if I were to come into the actions or if I were to come into the deploy software packages. If we want to make this available in our environment, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come to this configured sensors, and I'm going to hit new on here. So the first thing that I need to do is I need to select a sensor. And so when I click this, it's actually going to give me a pop-up with all the available sensors in my environment. I'm just going to choose one that's named Disks Free Space. So this is a sensor. It's simply going to query, tell me how much free space is available on a disk. This name here is going to be the name when somebody is in ServiceNow and wants to choose this sensor. In this case, I can go ahead and I can name this disk free space, the same as our sensor name, or I could give it a name like query the amount of free space on disk. Whatever you want to name this, the name of the configured sensor is going to be what is visible inside of ServiceNow. All I need to do then is I'm going to come through and I'm going to hit submit on here. This will now make this sensor available when we are in the Introspect UI. The same thing occurs if we wanted to configure any actions or if we wanted to configure any software that is available for deploy. As part of that integration core, we brought them all in, and then all you would need to do is come to the configured actions or the deploy software packages and make them available the same way we just did with the sensor. One thing to note here is I'm bringing in these different sensors or different software packages or actions individually. And in your Tanium environment, it is likely that you have hundreds, if not thousands of different sensors and actions and deploy packages that are available. Specifically, what I'm looking at is, as a help desk agent or as a problem manager, what are the specific sensors or actions or software that I want to have available at my fingertips without making it overwhelming? As we'll see in the Introspect UI, you have the ability to toggle through all of these, but you may not want to bring in every single sensor or every single action and make them available from your Tanium environment. Let's go in and I'm just going to come over to our computer table. So I'm going to come into our base items and come to our computers. And specifically, let's search for items that we had brought over from Tanium. I'm just going to select one of our Windows machines here. So we can do the same, Windows, Mac, or Linux. But one thing we'll notice here is up at the top right corner, we have this Launch Tanium Live UI button that is brand new, that is part of that integration core. And the Introspect UI specifically. So one thing I do want to note on here, this button is completely configurable. There's very fine-tuned and granular control over who gets to see this button and what pages they get to see this button. But I'm just going to go ahead and let's just click in and launch our live UI here. In a new tab, but we're still in ServiceNow, we have established a direct connection to this endpoint. This is live data in here. So What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually come in here and we're going to change the refresh time to 30 seconds. And I will note on here, you'll see 30, 60, 90, 120 seconds. Again, you have full control over this. So if you want to change the refresh times to a different value, you can configure those as options within that integration core SDK. So coming down here, we can see a bit of information about, the name, the IP, the serial number. This is all data that we already had in the CMDB. But what we can also see is on this particular machine right now, we are using 100% of the CPU. Additionally, coming down here through this direct connect, we can see all of the processes that are currently running on this machine. And not only can I see all the processes, if I wanted to come in here and I wanted to terminate a process, I can click this and it will live terminate that process immediately on the machine. And because of that integration core configuration that we had gone through, it's going to record that action history against the CI. And I launched this live UI when we were just looking at the computer table. So if I was on an incident, for example, and that incident had a Tanium managed configuration item associated with it, and I launched the live UI and I took action on a process, or I came over to a system service and I started, or I restarted, or I stopped a system service, that action is not only going to get logged against the configuration item, but it's going to get logged against that ticket. So again, this is super important in the context of somebody who is working on a help desk or somebody who is part of a change management process or a problem manager. Why did we do something? When did we do it? Who did it? And what was the context of all the history that went into this action? Let's go in here and let's pick something that hopefully isn't going to break one of our machines, but
I
we'll
don't think
kill
you have
this.
to look very far, Brandon. It's that video conferencing app. I'll bet you anything. So, okay. Uh, Here's the funny thing. We're doing this in our demo environment, and we have these apps set to respawn so that we can demo high CPU, right? So even though we just now killed it, it respawned immediately. So we know that's the app that was causing the problem. In a user environment, you're going to see the immediate relief there.
Absolutely. And the nice thing is, so our action history now tells us what happened. So at this time, and this is a limited view of the action history. This is all logged into a table in ServiceNow that has a lot more information about who did it. But I have the context of everything that we have now done against this endpoint. And this action history is always going to be saved against the CIs. So if you go back a few days or weeks or months and you want to see everything that has been done in the history of a configuration item, it is there stored against that CI record. Also, one thing we didn't even look at yet is if there are system crashes. So this is coming from the Tanium performance module. If there are system crashes or if there are application crashes, it is going to show that information in this introspect UI.
All right, so I'm looking at this blue button we haven't clicked yet. What does query sensor do?
I will point out one thing on here is we only have one blue button currently for query sensor. And if we come into query sensor, this is going to ask us to select one of the sensors that we configured. So the only sensor that we had currently configured was this disk free space. So I can come in, hit query. Again, this is all happening live, and it will now return all of the disks and this free space. Yeah, it's amazing how quickly this happens. And anything that you can think of in Tanium, any of the pre-configured sensors, any sensors that you have custom written for your Tanium environment can be queried here. The
now,
other
I have
thing
to
is,
stop and pause for a second because earlier when we were looking at those permissions, there was sensors, actions, and software packages, and we only lit up the one. So would there be other buttons here for other actions or software to deploy?
absolutely. So that's the reason that we're only seeing the one button here is we did not go through that process of configuring the different actions or the software that we want to make available. As part of that integration core setup, we brought in all of those actions and we brought in all of those deploy packages. All we would need to do is the same thing that we did for this sensor.
This is very customizable, right? So if there's like what I like to tell people is take your top 10 tickets that you can automate the solution, put it into a Tanium package. If it's maybe you have to whack a file and restart a service, something like that for a server, right? You can do that in a Tanium package, and then you just put it on the button and it's a click. And now you, instead of having to remote into that server every time or that workstation to fix it, you just put it on a button, and you're just increasing the efficiency by automating those top tasks. That seems like a really good place to put a bow on this as we wrap up today. Could you go back to that store page one more time, and let's show folks what they're looking for there?
All I've done is I went to the store, I searched for Tanium, and if I come down here to our Tanium integration core, can install this in any environment. It is available completely for free. And the first place to start is down here in the supporting links and documentation. So this integration core public doc with the latest version appended before the PDF, that is going to be the latest and greatest for any documentation that we have around this entire SDK, as well as for integrations such as Introspect that leverage the core SDK capabilities. So if there's anything else that you want to add to Introspect, or if you want more details about the configuration of actions and packages and sensors, it is all within this public documentation available from the ServiceNow Store.
And then the other one is the CI Introspect, right? So this is the SDK. And then you go back into the store and you see the CI Introspect UI. This just makes so much sense. And this is such a compelling demo. Brandon, again, thank you for coming on the show. Thank you for sharing it with us. So folks, in the show notes below, there's some other information, some links there to take you right here to these resources on the store at ServiceNow. So thank you for joining us for today's episode of Tanium Tech Talks. And until next time, Go-Tanium.